Alright, so a couple of days ago, a pretty massive storm hit the island of Puerto Rico, and in the process, we've seen an absolute collapse of their electrical grid that has left millions and millions of people on the island without power and access to clean and safe drinking water. So we've seen basically a complete blackout on this, or significantly less coverage than there should be from corporate media outlets who have basically been just hyper-focused on like the Queen's funeral and all that surrounding royal bullshit. And so I figured I would do a little bit of a deeper dive in terms of why this is actually happening and how the privatization of Puerto Rico's electrical grid and austerity and neoliberal policies that have been imposed on this territory, how that has led to the current crisis that they are facing right now. But before we get into the details of this great breakdown here from New Republic and Kate Aronoff, I wanted to just show you a little bit of a picture in terms of like what this is actually looking like on the ground with some of the destruction that we're seeing. So, I mean, just look at this shit. I mean, massive amounts of water that are just pouring through some of these communities, destroying houses, destroying, obviously infrastructure. I saw one where a straight up metal bridge was just carried off in the current and completely destroyed and wiped off the face of the earth. We also have another one here from Anna Maria, who says Puerto Rico never recovered from the devastation of Hurricane Maria back in 2017. Now the island is completely flooded and without electricity again, and she makes an appeal to go donate to some of these organizations that I'll link down here in the description if you want to go help people out in whatever way you can, and says to donate to local trusted organizations instead of donating to the Red Cross and FEMA. Completely agree on that front, but she had another video here that just gives us a perspective in terms of the sheer levels of destruction that we are seeing. So, I mean, just massive destruction. I mean, this is completely ridiculous. Again, just another perspective there. I mean, just massive amounts of water flooding into this island, flooding into this territory, and destroying millions of lives in the process. So now I want to get into a little bit of the background in terms of why this has happened and how, again, neoliberal policies enforced on what is essentially functionally a U.S. colony, and how that has exacerbated the current crisis. So, as Kate points out here, she says Puerto Rico can blame its total blackout on predatory companies and poor decisions in Washington. So this is a pretty long article here, but I do want to read through the entirety of it so that we can get a lot of these details in terms of how we got to this situation in the first place. But she starts off here saying that nearly 5 years to the day after Hurricane Maria left much of Puerto Rico without power for months, something eerily similar has now happened again. Hurricane Fiona, a Category 1 storm, which is like not even that intense of a storm. I mean, obviously it was catastrophic, but still, it could have been significantly worse, but even this led to a blackout. They say it swept through this past weekend, causing an island-wide blackout. Nearly 1.2 million homes were without power as of Tuesday morning. How many more homes, hospitals, and businesses get the lights turned back on, and how quickly will be largely up to Luma Energy, the U.S.-Canadian company that recently bought the right to handle the transmission and distribution of Puerto Rico's electricity. And she says the privatization of Puerto Rico's electricity was pitched as a panacea for the island's troubled grid, but it hasn't delivered on that promise so far. Instead, like any number of other privatization schemes supercharged after Maria, electrical grid privatization has been an invitation for companies to come make a profit off the provision of basic services. And this is not something that is just unique to Puerto Rico. It seems like it's a uniquely catastrophic failure from these private corporations there. But this is something, again, that you could see in an example like the Jackson, Mississippi water crisis. You could see this with California's electrical grid failures and their causing of wildfires due to their lack of maintenance and lack of safety standards, because they're basically just prioritizing one thing, and that is profit maximization, right? So when you have a situation with public utilities that every single citizen is relying on, how they should be operated, in my opinion, as a socialist, is for social good. I mean, right? It seems like that should be a basic thing that I think most people could get behind, and instead, because we live in the capitalist hellscape that we do here in the United States, everything just has to be geared towards profit maximization. And again, some of the consequences of that are that you're not going to be making adequate investments in upgrading and modernizing the infrastructure. You're not going to be making adequate investments in workers who are working on these things. You're just going to be slashing a lot of these, whether it's on labor or slashing costs in terms of maintaining safety standards, etc., and maintaining upkeep on a lot of this infrastructure. You're instead just going to be prioritizing giving money to your executives, your shareholders, and the people who sit at the top and actually have control over this, which obviously is going to have disastrous consequences. But she continues saying that that Fiona hit Puerto Rico so hard is a failure on multiple levels. Just $40 million of the $9 billion in federal funds that were meant to rebuild Puerto Rico's grid since Maria has been spent. Okay, $40 million of $9 billion that was supposed to be going towards fixing this broken system. Okay, so where did that money go? Is it just sitting around and not being utilized? Why is this money not being fucking spent? I mean, that in and of itself is a massive, massive problem there. But she says the damage caused by Fiona doesn't appear to be as extensive as what Maria inflicted, which knocked out much of the island's already fragile transmission and distribution infrastructure. Remember, Hurricane Maria was back under the Trump administration when he went there and basically did like the worst pandering of all time, where he was like shooting, paper towels into the crowd, like he was, making a joke of all of it. But they say that this time the damage to transmission lines appears to be minimal, which is somewhat of a good thing, I guess, relatively. But with the heaviest losses concentrated in the south and in the mountains. Still, though, outrages have been longer since Luma took over power lines from the Public Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, or PREPA, last June, and precious little progress has been made towards fixing some of the structural issues. They say that energy experts have long recommended that federal funds be used to create a more resilient grid that relies less on costly imported fossil fuels. That's not just because of environmental concerns, but also because of simple mechanical problems, like the electricity from fossil fuels needs to be generated at centralized power plants, a job that falls on PREPA, as it is still handling the electricity generation. And most of the plants are in the south, meaning that the electricity needs to be carried up transmission lines over the mountainous center of the country to population centers in the north. So it's just a structural problem in terms of why it doesn't make as much sense to have this centralized power here backed by a fossil fuel usage. But she continues saying that this Queremos Sol, which is We Want Sun in Puerto Rican, a platform for clean energy development and climate justice backed by a number of environmental and community groups and unions across the island, has pushed for a more decentralized and renewable grid that can be turned back on even when the grid endures massive damage. So far, that hasn't happened, even after the 2019 passage of a green energy law intended to bring more clean energy onto the grid. And part of the reason why this can't happen is, again, because you have corporations who are in charge of managing and keeping track of the spending of the Puerto Rican elected government. And in fact, you had laws that they're going to get into here that were passed under the Obama administration, basically again enforcing neoliberal austerity measures on this territory, and basically restricting their ability to actually make adequate public investments or to transition aggressively away from fossil fuel usage. But they continue saying that understanding why these expert-backed popular reforms haven't been enacted requires a longer view. Officially a territory, Puerto Rico is best understood as a colony of the United States, having been ceded to the U.S. by Spain as a result of the Spanish-American War in 1819 or 1898. Like other colonies, it has also long been a place for policymakers and business interests to test out new schemes. After a series of generous tax breaks for businesses expired in 2006, the island entered a prolonged depression that was compounded shortly thereafter by the global financial crisis, and successive governments borrowed money to stay afloat and fund basic services, eventually racking up more than $70 billion in debt. And exactly how that debt was acquired is still the subject of some controversy. Critics have accused banks of engineering ways to exceed borrowing limits, charging steep underwriting fees, and among the biggest bondholders are distressed asset investors, otherwise known as vulture funds, that swoop in to buy up so-called troubled assets on the cheap in the hopes of extracting big payouts down the line through scorched earth legal battles. And some of the same funds that have bought Puerto Rican debt have also bought up polluting fossil fuel assets across the globe that bigger companies have been eager to shed to appear more climate friendly. And they say, unlike companies or U.S. states that have trouble servicing their debts, Puerto Rico cannot formally declare bankruptcy. So this is where we tie into the Obama administration. They say that the Fiscal Oversight and Management Board, known as La Junta, was imposed by Congress and then the Obama administration in 2016 to oversee the debt restructuring process and the island's finances, executing effective veto power over plans made by its democratically elected government. So straight up like anti-democracy shit here, okay? Ignoring the will of the people in Puerto Rico, ignoring the will of what their elected representatives are trying to do to actually get some substantial reforms here, and instead imposing whatever the will is of the corporate America-backed U.S. federal government. But They say that the legislation that created the board, known as Promesa, doesn't require most of its members to even be from or living in Puerto Rico. So again, you have this like outsider effect and treating this essentially as a colony of the United States in service of corporate America. But they say that its chair is one of the intellectual architects of the board, law professor David Skeel Jr., who has consistently argued that indebted governments are better off having democracy taken away from them. So just screaming the quiet part out loud here, I guess, from this motherfucker David Skeel Jr. But they say that the model isn't exactly new. Skeel and his fellow travelers took inspiration in part from the Fiscal Control Board imposed by the state on New York City in the 1970s as a response to the fiscal crisis there, an early testing ground for sweeping neoliberal reforms executed in the name of fiscal responsibility. And more recently, Michigan's former Republican governor Rick Snyder imposed emergency managers on mostly majority black cities facing financial distress. And among the members of La Junta is former Michigan Budget Director John Nixon, who was one of the officials who hired the emergency manager who urged engineers to keep repairs to Flint's ailing water system to a minimum. And earlier this summer, the board sued the Puerto Rican government to stop it from implementing a law expanding private sector employees' vacation and sick time, overtime pay, and meal breaks, arguing that it would slow economic growth. Okay, first of all, how the fuck would that slow economic growth to just provide more adequate like safety nets to people who are employed? How the fuck is that going to slow economic growth? I mean, it depends on what you mean, I guess, by economic growth, whether you mean, you know, the profits of a lot of the wealthiest corporations and billionaires in the country, or do you mean economic growth in terms of materially improving the lives of average working class people? I think we know which side of that they were actually talking about here when they're talking about economic growth. But again, I mean, you see this across not just in Puerto Rico, but the rest of the United States as well, in cities like New York, in cities like Jackson, Mississippi. I mean, all of these places that are usually disproportionately minority cities as well are always going to be pushed to enact these neoliberal austerity measures in order to, you know, continue serving the interests of the wealthiest people within our society. I mean, this is not anything new. This has been the entire history of the United States, and you see this with catastrophic breakdowns like in Flint, Michigan, for example, where, I mean, they were without clean water for years and years and years as a result of corruption, as a result of financial mismanagement, largely from conservatives. And then, you know, you had that massive cover up and the scandal that followed suit after that. But what this comes down to is a lack of investment in public infrastructure, a lack of even treating basic public services as public services, and instead treating them as a way for, corporations and capitalists in this country to just extract profits to the detriment of those public services and actually being able to provide the services for the entirety of the population that is trying to use them. But they say that like structural adjustment packages imposed similarly by the International Monetary Fund on low and middle income countries across the globe, La Junta promised to bring Puerto Rico back from the brink of financial ruin in exchange for a series of reforms, typically under the guise of cultivating a positive investment climate to restore better access to financial markets. So again, it's not even just that it's not in Puerto Rico specifically, but it's also across the entirety of the United States. And, oh, by the way, it's also, across the entirety of the world, where the United States, through our various institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, basically gives like predatory loans to a lot of these various countries, and in exchange for getting some of that capital investment, you have to liberalize their markets is the way that capitalists use it, but open up your markets for privatization, open up your markets and public services for US multinational corporations to go exploit your resources on the cheap and exploit your labor as well. And so again, it's just neoliberal austerity for the poor, for the profit maximizing of the wealthy. But they say that those recommendations have included mass privatizations, steep cuts to pensions and benefits, and a drastic shrinking of the public sector workforce, frequently with the enthusiastic support of right-wing politicians there. They say the privatization push has been a breeding ground for grifters looking to make a quick buck. Before full privatization, PREPA's leadership courted a series of disastrous private sector contracts. The most high profile was awarded to the novice Montana-based firm Whitefish Energy to rebuild power lines after Maria, though there were several others. And she says, as I reported in 2020, private equity billionaire and Milwaukee Bucks owner Wes Edens has built a business model around growing demand for methane gas in the Caribbean, including in Puerto Rico, and new forest energy New Fortress Energy, which Edens founded and runs as the CEO, was awarded a $1.5 billion contract that left ratepayers to foot the bill for burning more expensive imported fuel that was ironically pitched as a means to make energy more affordable. And she finishes off here saying that anger at this energy corporation Luma is already simmering, and it's now boiling over. In Fiona's wake, calls have proliferated for the governor of Puerto Rico, Pedro Pierluisi, to cancel the company's contract before November 30th, after which the island could be saddled with a $1.5 billion penalty for severing ties, and public officials there are reportedly considering it, according to the Wall Street Journal. So, I mean, yeah, I think they should probably sever ties with that billionaire. But at the end of the day, I mean, the lesson here is pretty clear. Number one, obviously we have the worsening effects of climate change. We still have not addressed that in a meaningful capacity. We had the recent historic climate investment through the Inflation Reduction Act that was literally written by fossil fuel millionaire named Joe Manchin from West Virginia, who has a personal financial stake in maintaining the usage of fossil fuels. And you have similar lack of investment in renewable energy, which could be used to actually decentralize the power systems within Puerto Rico, right? I mean, you can't have these, as they were pointing out, just in a structural way, in a mechanical way. It doesn't make as much sense to have these centralized power systems where you're having to transport these, you're having to transport electricity over mountainous regions and make it incredibly more difficult and expensive to do so, just because you want to maintain your reliance on fossil fuels in this territory, when you could instead be directing a lot of those resources and funding towards actually investing in renewable energy and, providing this in a much more decentralized and available way that would also be more sustainable in situations like this. So again, the lesson at the end of the day here is that privatization of public utilities is pretty much unanimously always going to be a complete disaster, because you are, instead of treating it as a public service and trying to make it as widely available to as many people as possible and as efficiently as possible, you are instead choosing to maximize the profit seeking of a lot of these wealthy corporations and billionaires. And that's always going to lead to disastrous consequences. It's going to lead to slashes with neoliberal reform policies and pushing austerity on some of the most vulnerable people within whatever country or territory or state that you're talking about. You're going to be forced to enact, these austerity measures and austerity policies in the name of financial management. That is going to worsen the effects of, the financial situation on the poorest people within these places. And on top of that, it's not actually going to solve the underlying problem. I mean, again, you could look at all of these different various public utilities that have been privatized, whether it's in California or in Texas or in Puerto Rico or in Flint, Michigan. It is always going to lead to disaster, and the people who are going to face the brunt of the consequences of that disaster are going to be the poorest and most vulnerable people within whatever society that you happen to be talking about at the end of the day. So, I mean, obviously you need immediate relief, probably to the tune of billions and billions of dollars to be flooded into Puerto Rico, but you need that relief to be actual relief that is, intended in good faith to actually benefit average working class people and poor people within this territory in Puerto Rico, and not one that is going to just be money that is flooded into maintaining the fossil fuel usage, into maintaining the profit maximizing system that they have in place with their electricity grid, and actually start to aggressively transition to a much more sustainable model utilizing the resources that we have here in this country.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying